This is module 5 of the CAMTEM, Impacts of ACEs and Toxic Stress in Indigenous Communities. Module 5 focuses on the intergenerational transmission of adversity. And so we've talked a little bit in the beginning, we talked about ACEs, the ACEs aware mission, what ACEs are. In the second module, we talked about bias, multilogical perspectives. We talked about the CAMTEM book and how the CAMTEM book kind of goes along with this training and supplements the training. We also have talked about Indigenous tribes of California, a little bit about the history of tribes, which once again is just a few examples that we've talked about. And so now we're looking at the intergenerational transmission of adversity. And so once again, we have our training learning objectives to be able to define adverse childhood experiences, to describe how providing trauma-informed care for Indigenous communities must include discussions and understanding of the history and also the intergenerational transmission of adversity in order to provide this trauma-informed care. And then once again, ultimately for medical professionals, the importance of screening for ACEs. And so at the end of this module, participants will be able to understand how historical experiences relate to intergenerational trauma, intergenerational transmission of adversity, factors for toxic stress, and also looking at some protective factors from an Indigenous perspective. And so intergenerational trauma is sometimes referred to as historical trauma, multi-generational trauma, race-based trauma, and also you may hear unresolved historical grief. And so the common thread between these terms is that historical factors interact with current day stressors and can result in their either problematic or resilient outcomes in individuals, families, and communities. So intergenerational trauma occurs from an overwhelmingly traumatic event on an individual or a shared group. And some of these events can include not being able to mourn the loss of loved ones during the period of genocide. And this is one thing that sometimes we don't think about when we think about these massacres that occurred not only throughout the United States, not only throughout the state of California, but here locally. Sometimes we don't think about our people, our Indigenous peoples, not being able to mourn the loss of loved ones. So not only was it difficult to engage in burial ceremonies because entire villages were often decimated, but it also was part of policy, government policy, to disrupt these burial activities. So in 1881, there was a government ban placed on traditional burials. And so therefore, grief was compounded. Many Indigenous peoples were piled into mass graves, burned, or their bodies were partly saved as trophies for proof that the murder had taken place. And so the state of California, as I said before, paid $1 million in 1 year for the bounties of California Indigenous scalps. Grubik and Simmons, they have a book out that came out in 1984 that they worked with hundreds of descendants of Holocaust survivors, and they formed this clinical impression. They called it transposition, and it was the acting out of uncompleted mourning, of their parents who had not been able to adequately mourn the losses. And so different peoples are coming up with different ways to mourn those losses that had happened. I think about people's and stories, at different massacres. One young person in general, in particular, she hid in the swamp, and after she came out of the swamp, all of her people were gone. How would she have mourned the loss? You think about Lucy Tachetza Young, and the losing her father and her brother, eventually her whole village. how would she be able to mourn? Why this is important is because Indigenous peoples have traditionally had their own mourning processes. They have certain rituals, certain things that happen for a certain number of days. That's all part of this healing process. It helps a person to face the trauma and to be able to heal. But in this case, this is the part of that unresolved historical grief that we're talking about. Also in this discussion is thinking about the abuse and neglect that happened in boarding schools. And so children that were kidnapped and taken up to 1,000 miles from their homelands to attend boarding school, and they were forbidden to speak their Indigenous languages and culturally related activities. How did this impact them? Really thinking about that abuse and neglect. And there are people that if you ever watch a video called Journey to Forgiveness, it's people that they traveled across the country and interviewed, and many of these people are elders at this time who never have told any of their family members about the experiences that they had, were never talked about the trauma that they experienced. And for the first time, many of them are sharing their stories. And so when a person internalizes this, how does this impact them and their health? But also, how does it then impact their behavioral and biological health of their offspring? And so in looking at this abuse and neglect that happens in boarding school, we look at this as Maslow's hierarchy of needs and what a child needs in order to achieve self-actualization. We talked about this a little bit before, but self-actualization is when a young adult sees their purpose in the world and they make the motion and the movement to be able to achieve that purpose. But in order to get there, they have to have the strong foundation of physiological needs, the safety needs, the belongingness and love needs. And so we look at this model based off of what children experienced in boarding school, and children's physiological needs were not being met. When you look at physiological needs have to do with food, water, warmth, and rest. And they were malnourished, given small rations of food. As punishment, they're put into prisons and basements for up to 10 days with no food or water in the cold and in the dark. And so looking at that very foundation for a child to get to this point of self-actualization, to see their purpose in the world, not even getting past that first level. Much less looking at the second level, which is the safety needs, security and safety. And children's safety needs were not being met. They were physically abused for speaking their own Indigenous languages. As we talked before, they had red hot needles put through their tongues for speaking their language, their hands broken from being hit by a ruler for speaking language, and their mouths being washed out with wire brushes. These were not uncommon punishments. And so depending on the location, in addition to that, 80 to 98% of children in boarding school and residential school reported sexual abuse from the priests and dorm maidens in boarding schools. And so when we look at how does a child get to this point of seeing this worth and value within themselves and their contributions to the world, how do we get to that point when the physiological needs aren't met and the safety needs aren't met? And even when you look at the third level, which has to do with belongingness and love needs, psychological needs such as belongingness, esteem, were also disregarded in boarding schools. And children from the same family or village were immediately separated. And when they started to begin relationships with new people, or if the dorm maiden started to notice that a relationship or a friendship was being established between two children, that they'd immediately be separated. So there was deliberate intent to ensure that this friendships and relationships were not established. So now we're looking at the physiological needs not being met, the safety needs not being met, the psychological needs not being met. And so then finally at the peak of Maslow's hierarchy of needs sits self-actualization. And achieving one's full potential, including creative activities, children aren't afforded the necessary environment to establish a strong foundation in the pyramid. And so few actually reach this stage of self-actualization. Yet often, studies are being done about why is it that those that were in boarding school were not able um, to make these sorts of contributions. Why did they turn to alcoholism? Why did they have suicidal ideations? All of these different questions that we have. But if we look at the basic needs and looking at how the needs were met, then it helps us to kind of understand how boarding schools actually impacted children who experience them. And so then we also are looking at, and we talked about the forced removal from homelands. And so thinking about how are Indigenous peoples impacted from that forced removal. And so we know that Indigenous peoples were torn from their homelands and places that they had been from time immemorial. They're moved on to reservations where sometimes they're held in barbed wire fences, fed through troughs, as we shared, monitored by soldiers of the federal government. We know that many people died on the marches. We talked about how traumatic it was for Indigenous peoples to be separated from their homelands where they had been for thousands of years. How does that impact not only them, but their future generations? We also talked about slavery and concubinage, that children were kidnapped and sold as slaves and concubines, that we learned that even through this kidnap and slavery, that many children were birthed from these arrangements. And so how does that impact intergenerationally? Not to mention the ongoing oppression, racism, and discrimination. So it's very important to understand that many of the systems, policies, and procedures that were put into place during periods of genocide, colonial education, and relocation continue to resonate in systems of today. And so I strongly encourage people to really look at the history of the institutions to which you're working. Because in looking at why was the educational system created for Indigenous peoples, it was created to assimilate, to kill the Indian, save the man. Why was the judicial system created? Why was the police force created? Why was the social work system created? Really looking at the history of these institutions, because sometimes they were created during eras when Indigenous peoples were not considered citizens of the United States. They weren't considered citizens until 1924, but often in many cases when there was actual bounties and attempted extermination of Indigenous peoples. So we really have to think about the history of these institutions as well. And so research indicates that there's a direct correlation between historical experiences, such as genocide and boarding school, and the current social indicators of Indigenous peoples. And so likewise, these social indicators have been theoretically and empirically linked to social, economic, cultural, and political inequities, and not an inherent native trait or gene. And so that's important to understand, that a lot of this isn't necessarily about the genes of Indigenous peoples, but it's about the systemic nature of the actual programs. And so good places to look for more information on this is Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart has a book called The American Indian Holocaust, Healing Historical Unresolved Grief. That's a real good source to use. Elizabeth Vast and Delphine Colin Vizina have Historical Trauma, Race-Based Trauma and Resilience of Indigenous Peoples, and that one's a literature review. So those are two sources if you're interested in learning more about that. And so Healthy traditional communities were able to deal with trauma. This is another definition of intergenerational trauma. Healthy traditional communities were able to deal with trauma through the sweat lodge, rituals to support those left behind by loved ones, and through the adoption of orphan children as a regular practice. But when the entire communities experienced the same traumas for generations, the very mechanism that helped them to cope became destroyed in the process. So the whole group becomes frozen in time and the collective narratives become post-traumatic. And this is what I was just talking about as far as that with burial, for example, many indigenous tribes have their own culture and their own beliefs around how to send someone off or that process. But when it's a traumatic period like this, and then it's the whole community, that the whole group becomes frozen in time, that there is no healing process in that. And so that was an important piece that point here that Fast and Colin Bazina make. And so then when we talk about the intergenerational transmission of adversity, so the intergenerational trauma is something that we're talking about. There's a traumatic experience that happens, and then how it can affect that person and their child rearing practices, kind of their behavioral approach with other people, and how that can transfer kind of intergenerationally. But then we also are looking at another added aspect, which is the intergenerational transmission of adversity. And so parental adverse childhood experiences. So we talk about adverse childhood experiences that a child experiences firsthand on their own. And then now we're looking at parental adverse childhood experiences, and toxic stress can affect the health of subsequent generations, with effects transmitted from parent to child and even to grandchild. And so ACE is Aware and the ACE is Aware initiative now acknowledges intergenerational transmission of adversity, what in Indigenous literature has referred to as intergenerational trauma for several years. ACE is Aware refers to as intergenerational transmission of adversity. And this can include changes to parental and child neuroendocrine, immune, metabolic, and genetic regulatory health. And we talked about all of the different pieces that when a child experiences adversity, childhood experiences, how that impacts their health. And so parenting behaviors, experiences, societal factors, and historical traumas also influence how health risks are passed from the parent to the child. And so this is a diagram, a figure that illustrates how the parental adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress lead to multiple biological changes that may impact the health of children. And so remember, we talked about how adverse childhood experiences, social determinants of health, things like racial discrimination, separation of child and parent, etc., how that can lead to toxic stress. And we also talked about how there's different types of stress, and some stress can be positive stress. Other types of stress is shorter lived, but toxic stress is stress that is high levels of stress for extended periods of time. And so when you look at this diagram or figure, it looks at parental adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress, that how it impacts the health of their children. And so children born with to parents with high ACEs scores are more likely to have neuropsychiatric, behavioral, and physical health problems, including sleep disturbances, anxiety, depression, attention deficit disorder, asthma, autism, schizophrenia, and post-traumatic stress disorder, among other things. And so parental ACEs and other life stressors can affect their offspring both directly, and that can be through disruptions in caregiver stress hormones. It can be through the neuroendocrine immune metabolic function, epigenetics, and indirectly through caregiver behavior as well, societal factors, and historical and cultural trauma. And so intergenerational transmission of adversity, it's important that it's both biological and behavioral. And that's something that we were talking about during the break, is looking at that there's two things that are happening here. And so these studies also provide a valuable frame to expand from focusing solely on the transmission of ACEs from an individual to their offspring to that of historical trauma. And so the impacts of an individual's early exposure to adversity and stress may be passed through several generations. So recent scientific advances have begun to uncover the mechanism of this longer range intergenerational transmission. So studies, reviews, and commentaries have evaluated the offspring of survivors of the Holocaust, Native American genocides, 9/11, and slavery. And so this comes from the Roadmap for Resilience. And I would highly recommend that if people want to learn more on intergenerational transmission of adversity, to read this report. It's available online, and it was written by the California Surgeon General, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, and her team. She is also the person that reviewed, and her team reviewed and approved and certified this particular training. Also, increased ACEs are associated with an increased risk for challenging and social determinants of health conditions. So structural inequities, including lack of community investment, educational resources, economic opportunities, transportation availability, all affect development, health, and quality of care. And so both interpersonal and structural racism also promote toxic stress. Such factors significantly contribute to the perpetuation of ACEs and toxic stress across generations. So therefore, policy systems and societal norms must address historical and current racial trauma as implemented strategies to decrease the burden of toxic stress for minorities and marginalized communities. I think this is really important because sometimes when we think of racism or structural racism, interpersonal racism, sometimes when we think of these things, we tell ourselves to just deal with it. And we're thinking that it's something that we, the victim of that, has to endure. But what we're learning through scientific evidence is that these heavily impact, perpetuate ACEs and toxic stress across generations. And so it's not just something that a group of people or person should deal with. Rather, it's really important in really learning how to address these sorts of things for the health of that person and for ongoing generations. And so once again, when we think about this trauma-informed care principles, we revisit this again. And so now we're learning all of these different pieces. We've learned now about adverse childhood experiences and how that impacts toxic stress. We learned about social determinants of health. We've learned how racism, discrimination, structural racism, for example, how these things impact toxic stress as well. We've also learned how toxic stress impacts the health of a person. We've talked about tribes and histories that are also in addition to that. And so many indigenous peoples, children are facing these current ACEs, but on top of that, you have the parental adverse childhood experiences. And on top of that, you have the intergenerational trauma. And on top of that, you have the intergenerational transmission of adversity. And on top of that, you have ongoing oppression and systemic and structural interpersonal racism. So indigenous peoples are heavily impacted by toxic stress from many different sources. And so in learning this and in understanding it, what does that then mean for trauma-informed care? Once again, establishing physical and emotional safety of patients and staff. How do we do that? And really thinking and taking a moment, think about what we've learned, what we know from core ACEs aware trainings, what we know from our work in the field, and how we can combine that in thinking about how do we build trust between the provider and the patient. And knowing and kind of understanding the history of institutional frameworks, how do we shift that paradigm and support a nurturing, trusting, safe relationship that recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma exposure on physical and mental health? And so we have some testimonies to share. And so the first testimony is from Serenity Bowen.
Bowen to we, greetings from We Outland. My name is Serenity Bowen, and I am a lecturer at Humboldt State University and an LCSW with a private practice. I've been a social worker for 30 years, have worked in various different areas of the field. I'm first generation Indigenous and Irish, and I grew up with a keen awareness of the impact of adverse childhood experiences in my own life. I come from a long history of trauma survivors. As professionals, we always have to be mindful that when folks come with these adverse childhood experiences, it really is hard sometimes to trust other people, to trust situations, to believe that there is possibility. Sometimes we, I think, can be damaged in those relational ways from having these incidents occur that really violate the sense of safety. So we're moving forward in lives with, folks, myself, other folks who have high ACEs, moving forward in our lives with this sense of always having to be alert, always having to be hypervigilant and mindful of when we are safe or not safe. It can really limit the ability to take risk. These early traumatic experiences change the brain. They literally rewire the brain to be more keen for these fight or flight survival tendencies that people can have. And they disrupt attachment, depending on what the adverse childhood experience was, depending on the time of development that it occurred, the severity, the nature of the relationship with the person who maybe inflicted the trauma. It can change the brain. It can change literally how the person navigates through the world emotionally and neurologically. And so we have to understand that that these are more than just these experiences, that they really do have an impact on the outcomes of that person's life, unless there is some healing that takes place, unless there are some interventions that bring forth different coping skills and heal relational attachments. And, we also know that when someone experiences a childhood trauma, that there can be a tendency to self-medicate. I definitely think about the addiction in my family. I think about the ways in which, my relatives were medicating their traumas, medicating their anxieties, medicating their mental health outcomes that were either, genetic or maybe trauma induced. Sometimes those things are hard to discern, and then they can really kind of coexist in ways where it becomes difficult to understand if someone is really experiencing like a brain chemical issue or if they are really just reacting to the traumas that they've experienced. How do we delineate that? How do we understand that? I mean, beyond really scanning and understanding the brain, it becomes difficult, because it's sort of that nature nurture argument again, and I think those two things can't be separated always. Strength based practitioners are going to not just assess the ways in which people are challenged or the deficits that they may experience in terms of their attachment, their mental health. They're also going to look at the ways in which they are strong and resilient, and ways in which they have utilized the protective factors in their life to survive and thrive even with these childhood experiences that were traumatic. We really cannot consider that an assessment is a good assessment unless we're also looking at those strengths, that we're also looking at those protective factors. I feel like it's impossible to do good work unless we get the whole picture. And the whole picture isn't just the adverse childhood experience. It's the protective factors that come into play as well, and the ways in which that person has overcome those challenges and those early traumas to continue to be resilient in their life. Intergenerational trauma in and of itself has a powerful, powerful impact on outcomes for people. We understand this. We see it time and time again. We see this, in any kind of work that we do. When I was at child welfare, there'd be stacks of files where it was just intergenerational traumas, the same family. Without those interventions, without those real changes occurring, it's more likely that we might experience the same traumas that our parents experienced, at least to some extent. I think it's important to understand that a lot of these experiences are around relational violation, right? Around trust that's been broken, or violence that has occurred, or a sense of safety that's been shattered in those early childhood development stages. And understanding those attachment pieces. I mean, sometimes that stuff is pre-verbal. Like sometimes those attachment pieces are disrupted in the earlier stages of development, where you're not even going to have that long-term cognitive recollection of it. You're just going to understand that you don't feel like you can rely on people. You don't feel like people will come to you when you need them. You don't feel safe in intimate contacts. Like, we don't always make the connection. And so I think what is essential is to not make those assumptions about somebody else's sense of safety and sense of being able to trust you, that we can't always know, because sometimes people don't even know where those pieces come from, or why they're struggling in the ways that they are. And I think in my work, it becomes essential to normalize for people that some of these things are so integral to our development and so cellular in nature that it's almost like really impossible to cognitively explain or understand it from this intellectual place, that it's really just a sense of being not safe. And so I think we have to, as professionals, be mindful of that, and be mindful of those places where people aren't going to trust us, and to respect that boundary, but also to understand that it makes sense, given the context of some of these experiences, that would be there. And so it's not about shame. It's about understanding that they're still surviving, they're still thriving, they're still living, regardless of these experiences, that becomes more the focus. I think what's important in our work with people who've experienced high ACEs, or ACEs in general, is to always refocus to what are the cultural strengths, what are the resilience factors, what are the protective pieces that come in play. I want to make sure that we're not just focusing on deficits, that we're not just focusing on the ways in which someone maybe have a larger proclivity to health or death, or just that whole framework is not an empowering framework necessarily. And it doesn't always encourage people. So I think the most important piece that I want to articulate is, when you're talking to someone about their adverse childhood experiences and you begin to realize just the intensity of traumas that they have experienced in their life and what that means, that you don't overlook their strengths, that you don't overlook their protective factors, that you don't overlook their resilience, that you bring just as much attention and light and focus on those things that than you do in anything else that you're doing in that work, that becomes your primary agenda in the work, is to help them see those things, to help them build upon those things, to provide opportunities for them to become aware of these things in their own lives. You survived, which means you can survive, which means you can continue to survive. And I think if we help people understand that our experiences can also be our strength, that we can turn those things around. Getting in touch with the pieces that are protective factors, culture, language, tradition, understanding that things that may be hard are also tainted with things that may be really good, and that those pieces, that reclamation of self is part of that journey of healing. It becomes essential and important when you're talking about communities of people who have had their identity stripped away, that have been punished, killed, brutalized for practicing that which they are connected to, for that interrelational understanding that you take away someone's identity, you can take away their ability to thrive, to be whole, to be connected. And the reclamation of self is a lifelong journey. It's not like, oh, I'm going to reclaim myself and it's going to happen. It takes time. It takes healing. It takes support. It takes these pieces to all move together in tandem so that the person can begin to see the things that we see in them. It's a beautiful process, that's what the healing is about, right? It's not that you do for others, it's you help others see what they can do in their own lives. How do we reduce these adverse childhood experiences in our communities? And how do we, minimize the impact? And I think really it's about helping create spaces to have these conversations and to bring them into a cultural context that makes sense for people, and emphasize community and emphasize these interrelational pieces, so that we are all sort of taking responsibility for each other in these contexts, and that we're looking out for each other and being relational. I think this individualization of colonialist perspective is devastating to relational communities, and in order to heal and to recover and to mitigate further traumas in our communities, we need to decolonize those ways of being and create different, more indigenous ways of relating to each other that are about respect and interdependence and building that trust and connection with each other. So those things are important. And we talk about self-care. What is self-care, right? What I mean by that is really about, ensuring that you're caring for yourselves in the way that you're caring for other people, that is also your priority, that especially if you're coming with these histories, that you have some self-reflection that's happening in your work, that you're able to understand your responsibility in continuing your own healing in the journey, because you will be triggered, you will be impacted by the stories, by the relationships. In some ways, I also think that these adverse childhood experiences change the way we interface with the world. And I think for professionals, you need to understand that this rapport building, this trust, this process of getting people to really be honest with you and work with you, it's not going to be immediate, and it may never happen. And it's really important to honor people's personal sovereignty around sharing what they want to share, not sharing what they don't want to share, allowing you in their life, not allowing you, like all of these pieces are really important, because this journey is not about the social worker. It's not about you. It's about what that person needs for their own process, and how you plant those seeds, how you are able to sort of change their understanding or perspective of who can be safe in their life, and show them that there are attachments that are okay. There are relationships that are safe and healthy, and important to be able to model that.
Ayakui, Now Jim McQuillen, May Chalk, Crescent City, and I would say Kape Ak. I live in Crescent City, California. Ayakui is a greeting from the Yurok people. I'll say hello. And a little bit about my background. I'm a licensed mental health professional in the state of California, MFT. Also a former school principal, and I'm currently the director of education for the Yurok tribe. And we oversee a pretty large department with early childhood education programs, childcare, Head Start. And then we have a pretty large support program for K-12 students out in the public schools. And then we support our higher education students with supporting our Yurok students who are out there going to college and university throughout the United States. We typically have about 105 tribal members going to college from the Yurok tribe. The Yurok tribe is the largest tribe in the state of California, and we're positioned up in the Pacific Northwest, bordering Oregon to the north and the Pacific Ocean to the west, and along the Klamath River, our home since the beginning of time is along the Klamath River, and then the coast, our coastal villages and our river village sites. My background, again, is in mental health and in education, which kind of combined in my current work, working with children and developing programs for the schools, public schools, and trying to help our students in their recovery through educational programs and activities. For our families, we're still in recovery. We're still in recovery from what happened in our history, the genocide, the attempts at exterminating our people here in Northern California. We're still in recovery from that. Some call it an intergenerational trauma. We're in recovery from that. What that means is an impact on our families and some of the historical abilities of our people to parent our children. That was interrupted by the genocidal acts that occurred from about 1850 on, where there were attempts to exterminate Yurok people and the people of Northern California. And there was a forced boarding school era where our people were forced, and children were taken by force from their loved ones and sent off to boarding school. And there was an interruption of the family life with those boarding school experiences, where interrupted the ability to have relationships in families, and those nurturing relationships were interrupted by the forced boarding school. And of course, that's where we get our ability to become parents, and those nourishing relationships that we all need in order to thrive. That got interrupted for Native people along the way. This happened before boarding school right up until 1920, 1930. that created some interruptions in our ability to parent and receive proper parenting with our children. And so the grandchildren and the adult children today still carry those wounds, and what that translates to in terms of abuse is that neglect situation. We know neglect happens far more often than the actual physical or sexual abuse. Neglect. Sometimes parents don't even realize that they're practicing neglect if they didn't receive those nourishing opportunities themselves. We see it transferring to there's that neglect of school experiences where not sending your children to school when you should be, or providing support that children need when they attend school, or if they need special education, not providing that type of support or understanding of the support. If you don't know, it's hard to provide that. And then, of course, other types of needs get unmet. Jed Smith came through here in the 1830s, and first contact for a lot of Yurok people were 1850, 1870. And then it was downhill from there, of lots of changes, very rapid changes where the loss of practices and culture and upheaval, they call it the 49ers, came rushing through, the gold rush and the rush for resources, and a lot of change for our people, cultural changes. They talk about all the items that left this area because of not only the gold diggers, but those seeking other treasures from this area, taking our dance items and our sacred items out of this area, and large wagon trains leaving the area with our precious dance items that now can be found in universities and other museums that were taken from this area. Prevention and culture is more of a strengths-based model of we know in our community there are educational bearers, and those people who know, those people who have that information, and bringing those together for children is so important, and families, of reacquainting our children and our families back with their traditions can be so healing and so rewarding and fulfilling for families. And it can be through foods, of our food gathering and traditions that way, whether it be eeling, which I had the pleasure of going with my sons recently to go down to the mouth of the river and catching eels, the lamprey eel, we call it the Kate Win, or fishing on the river, the salmon. It can be as simple as that, our food gathering traditions, acorns, and other seafoods from our area. And it's such a healthy activity for families, and of course, very nutritionally based also, of reconnecting our families back with the traditional foods. And then other avenues in the schools, we have lots of new programs that are reintroducing kids to the culture. It could be dance practice, or ceremonies, bringing that into the schools. It's a place where all kids have to be as a public school, and using that opportunity to help kids feel comfortable, and they can see and feel their culture in this public setting of school. We've had dance practices and introduction of our ceremonies, our brush dance ceremony, in the school setting. And you can see kids who are head hangers and maybe staying in the shadows, or those wall hangers, coming out and feeling good and feeling pride by participating in the dance demonstration in the school setting. It's such a good feeling to see that, and seeing kids come alive and speak up for the first time, or even try to jump center, or backup sing, or some students have even brought a family song and tried it out in the school setting. It's really to see that happen in the public schools. And then it's education for everyone. The teachers and the other staff get to see this and ask questions, and it just opens up a whole nother avenue in an educational setting. So bringing curriculum alive to our public schools has been a great opportunity, again, to help Native kids feel comfortable, to see their own history, see their community represented in the public schools can really help in terms of the mental health and wellness and identity for students as they're developing, to help see, hey, that I'm important enough to be recognized in the curriculum. I'm important enough to be recognized in social activities at school. Those are all identity builders, and to help in terms of the mental health and wellness of students, and helping us through to get again recover from trauma. That identity development is so important, so important. So part of our restoration efforts and bringing back our dances and bringing back our customs and our culture and helping us with our mental health is restoring our dances for this area. And it started in the 1970s in our restoration work with our dances, and a few people in the area were trusted and still held the knowledge and practices of our ceremonies, brought those dances back. They were trusted to go out, and those regalia holders of those dance items, our dance leaders, were able to go out and borrow those dance items from those regalia holders, and they were trusted to bring those items out, and our dances came back, in about 1970, and we started an effort to revive our ceremonies here, and we've been on a strong effort since then, since the 1970s, to restore our ceremonies. And it's so nice to see our children and families participate in those dances today and learn songs and try out for the first time, and coming in and dancing in front of their family, in front of the community. And for our area, it's been so vital and has helped families in so many ways to look forward to those ceremonies and the healing practices of our people in Northern California here. The people of Northern California were a forgiving people. We've had systems that have been in place for tens of thousands of years, so systems that allow for recovery. We have a system that allows for settling up, similar to many, many other cultures and religions, where you have avenues to forgive and avenues to restore and come back into your community. If you use somebody else's fishing hole or without permission and you fish there, and you could settle up, and they can fine you. They can create a fine and say, hey, you used my fishing hole without permission, and historically you would have to pay that fine. They could maybe demand 10 fish from you, or demand something from you, and you would make payment to make that right. Or there could be other acts of violence or wrong acts that you would be asked to settle. If you hurt somebody or even took a life of someone else, that you could go to a mediator in the village, and they would help this disputing parties to find an avenue to settle that and restore that. And you would be able to make that payment and restore that relationship. People need avenues to come back into the community. They need those practices, for us to uphold those practices to help them come back into the community. And we all had those in our religions, in our societies. That that equals community health. That equals a thriving community able to recover. And it takes us all to see that and be a part of that as a learning process. You know, walk thou, walk thou. Thank you.
Moorehead Jr. I'm Talawa in Yurok, and I'm part of the Big Lagoon Rancheria. I'm grew up in Humboldt County. I went to Big Lagoon Elementary and McKinleyville High. I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, and I'm also currently the executive director of Two Feathers Native American Family Services, who provides mental health and wellness programming for Native American youth and families in Humboldt County. So I've been doing a lot of work with Native youth over the last 4 years in Humboldt County. And, you know, what I've seen is a lot of positives. There's so much to work with in our community. There's so much pride. There's so much culture that's thriving. But there's also a lot of abuse, neglect, challenges that stems from historical and ongoing oppression and trauma and toxic stress. And I think one of the ways to think about that, the impact of that in our community, is through a relational lens, is thinking about relationships and what does poverty, what does trauma, what does stress do to people. I think it turns off often our ability to trust, our ability to have hope, our ability to believe in ourselves and believe in others. And I think one of the things that is in our indigenous communities is a respect for others, a respect for ourselves. That if you were to come into one of our elders' houses, they would give you home, they would give you food, they would really care for you. That is in who we are as local Native people of this area. And I think what toxic stress or trauma does is it robs us of that ability. Growing up in an environment that is toxic and has been toxic, the United States environment, the United States community, robs us of those abilities that are inherent in our cultures of caring about ourselves and caring about other people. And so as a professional and in my role as executive director clinical psychologist, I work with the youth to bring out what is part of who we are as Native people, to respect ourselves and to respect others, to care for ourselves and to care for others. And if you look at what trauma does to the brain, it impacts negatively that ability to care about ourselves and to care about others. And so what I do through showing up and working with kids and Native kids and families on an individual basis or in programs is to be curious and to help them to think about how they can care about themselves, to reflect on their own life story and to reflect on the life story of other people. Because if we do that, then I think that we'll have less violence, we'll have less abuses, because really if we have empathy, kindness, and compassion that is rooted in our traditions and that is impacted by stress and trauma and neglect, then we're going to have a better community. If we have more youth and youth growing up to care about other people, then they're going to actually care about themselves more. And that's in our traditions. And so, you know, I think that's the role that I've been playing, is trying to create opportunities for relational connection and for people to care about themselves. There's messages throughout our traditions locally, Native traditions locally, that says the importance of caring about yourself and caring about others. And so I've been working with youth and families to do that. And so my message to providers, medical providers, is to really ask about folks' stories, to get them to be curious about their own story, where they come from, who they are, and also to help them to think about other people. Because if you're thinking about other people, I would argue that the research shows that you're actually going to be more physically healthy. If you have empathy for other people, if you have empathy for yourself, you're actually going to be more physically and mentally, psychologically, spiritually healthy. So that's my recommendation. My recommendation is to practice and help youth and Native families practice empathy, kindness, and caring about themselves and other people. Working with Native youth and families, one of the biggest things that we have to prioritize, trust. And if you look at the history of the United States, you look at what's going on currently with social injustices, many Native youth and families should not trust outside providers. And so we have to look at how we can build trust with Native youth and their parents. And one of the ways I think you build trust is through cultural practices and really understanding what matters to Native youth and families. And often what matters to Native youth and families increasingly in the 21st century is cultural practices. They want to learn how to fish. They want to learn their stories. They want to learn what it means to be a Native person in the 21st century. So if you can go out of your way and really be intentional about understanding how being a Native person in the 21st century is different than being a non-Native person, and be curious, because in order to build trust, you have to know what is of interest to Native youth and families. And so at Two Feathers, what we've done is a combination of cultural programming, such as our stick game, our flower dance, or just Native-based mentorship to build trust and engagement with Native youth. And then once we've had that trust and engagement, then they get into our counseling program. Then they start working on the trauma and stuff that's impacted them in their life. But until you get the trust and until they know that you know where they're coming from, there's not going to be any programs because they won't show up. As a trained clinical psychologist, I think one of the things that I've learned over the years is how much, whether it's in the medical field, whether it's in psychology, social work, mental health, generally speaking, how much we individualize, psychologize, biologize social, systemic, structural, political issues. And that does a disservice, I think, to communities such as Native youth and their families, because often what they're coming in and presenting with is not an individual problem. It's not even a tribal problem. It's a social, structural, historical, political problem. And so if the point is to build a solid relationship and around trust and respect, we have to stop ourselves when we're working with Native youth and families and make sure that we're not pathologizing at the individual level or pathologizing the Native youth for structural and systemic and social issues. That if we're able to take into consideration those political, systemic, structural issues into our interpretations of the work with Native youth and families, we're actually going to be able to empathize better, be able to connect better. And that's not what we're trained to do. We're trained to pathologize oppressed communities, such as many Native communities, and say they're the problem. They're not the problem. There's tremendous resiliency. There's tremendous thriving in Native communities because they've had to face 500 plus years of obstacles. And so when you're working with Native youth and families, to make sure that the intrapsychic, the biological factors that may be leading to some of the issues are just one component of the issue, that there's 500 plus years of different issues that are important to take into consideration.
All right. So that concludes our module 5. Next week, or not next week, tomorrow we'll continue module 6 and module 7 at 1 o'clock, 1 to 3:30 on Friday. So I look forward to seeing both all of you tomorrow. So have a good day.